He was the king's son, the heir everyone wanted. Handsome, charismatic, beloved by the people. And one morning, his own father woke up to news that would break any parent's heart. His son had stolen his throne. This is the story of Absalom, the prince who almost became king. Not through inheritance, not through conquest, through a slow, calculated betrayal of the man who gave him life. But here's what makes this case different from any political coup in history. The father saw it coming. He had been warned years earlier that the sword would never depart from his house. And when his own son marched an army against him, David didn't fight back. He ran. To understand how a prince becomes a traitor, we need to go back. Not to the rebellion itself, but to the crime that started everything. The year is approximately 1000 BCE. David sits on the throne of a united Israel, the most powerful king the nation has ever known. He has multiple wives, and from those wives, multiple sons. Among them is Absalom, third in line for succession, born to Mudasuch, a princess from the neighboring kingdom of Geshur. The text describes Absalom with unusual attention. In all of Israel, Scripture says, there was no one so highly praised for his handsome appearance. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. But in all Israel, there was none to be so much praised as Absalom for his beauty. 2 Samuel chapter 14 verse 25. Remember that detail. Absalom's appearance matters. In the ancient world, physical beauty was often interpreted as a sign of divine favor. People looked at Absalom and saw a king. But Absalom wasn't just handsome. He was also fiercely loyal to his full sister Tamar, one of the few people who shared both his father and mother. And it was Tamar who set everything in motion. The text tells us that Amnon, David's firstborn son and heir apparent, became obsessed with Tamar. 2 Samuel chapter 13 opens with a disturbing admission. Amnon was so vexed that he fell sick for his sister Tamar. Note the language. The Hebrew word, translated vexed, carries the sense of being distressed to the point of illness. Amnon's desire consumed him. With the help of a cousin named Jonadab, described pointedly as a very subtle man, Amnon devised a scheme. He feigned illness. He asked David to send Tamar to his chambers to prepare food for him. And when she arrived, alone, he violated her. The aftermath is devastating to read. The text says that after the assault, Amnon hated Tamar with a hatred greater than the love he had claimed to feel. He threw her out, bolted the door behind her. Tamar tore her garment of many colors, the robe that marked her as a virgin princess, put ashes on her head, and went away crying. She went to one person, her brother Absalom. And Absalom her brother said unto her, Hath Amnon thy brother been with thee? But hold now thy peace, my sister. 2 Samuel chapter 13 verse 20. Now here's what the text actually says about what happened next. It gives us two critical pieces of information. First, when King David heard what Amnon had done, he was very wroth. The king was furious. Second, he did nothing. The text moves immediately to Absalom's response. And that response is chilling in its restraint. Absalom spake unto his brother, Amnon neither good nor bad, for Absalom hated Amnon, because he had forced his sister Tamar. Neither good nor bad, for 2 full years. Most people miss what's happening here. Absalom isn't forgiving. He isn't moving on. He's waiting, planning. The silence isn't peace, it's a fuse burning slowly toward an explosion. After 2 years, Absalom invited all the king's sons to a sheep-shearing feast at Baal-hazor. He specifically requested that Amnon attend. And when Amnon's heart was merry with wine, Absalom gave the order, Strike Amnon. His servants obeyed. The crown prince of Israel was dead. Absalom fled. He ran to Geshur, his mother's homeland, and stayed there for 3 years under the protection of his maternal grandfather, King Talmai. David mourned. The text says he mourned for his son every day, though scholars debate whether that refers to Amnon or Absalom. Either way, the king was paralyzed. He had lost one son to murder, another to exile, and his daughter to a trauma from which she never recovered. This is the context. This is the foundation on which everything else is built. After 3 years, David's general Joab noticed that the king's heart longed for Absalom. Through an elaborate ruse involving a wise woman from Tekoa, Joab convinced David to allow Absalom to return to Jerusalem. But here's where it gets complicated. David permitted Absalom to return, but refused to see him. 2 Samuel chapter 14, verse 24. And the king said, "Let him turn to his own house, and let him not see my face." So Absalom returned to his own house, and saw not the king's face. So Absalom dwelt 2 full years in Jerusalem, and saw not the king's face. 2 Samuel chapter 14, verse 28. 2 more years. Absalom lived in the same city as his father, could probably see the palace from his window, and David refused to speak to him. Think about that. A son kills his brother to avenge his sister's rape, a rape their father refused to punish. The son flees for 3 years, returns home, and then waits another 2 years for his father to acknowledge his existence. By the time Absalom finally forced a meeting by setting Joab's barley field on fire to get his attention, 5 years had passed since Amnon's death. 5 years of silence. 5 years of simmering resentment. When David finally summoned him, the text says the king kissed Absalom, a gesture of reconciliation. But for Absalom, it may have been too little, too late. Now here's where it gets interesting. 2 Samuel chapter 15 opens with a single verse that changes everything. And it came to pass after this, that Absalom prepared him chariots and horses, and 50 men to run before him. After what? After the reconciliation, after the kiss, after David finally acknowledged his son. Absalom's response to his father's forgiveness was to begin planning a coup. The method was brilliant. The text describes it in detail. Absalom would rise early and station himself beside the road leading to the city gate, the place where legal disputes were settled. When anyone came to bring a case before the king for judgment, Absalom would intercept them. "Of what city art thou?" he would ask. And when they answered, Absalom would say something remarkable. "See, thy matters are good and right, but there is no man deputed of the king to hear thee." Absalom said moreover, "O that I were made judge in the land, that every man which hath any suit or cause might come unto me, and I would do him justice." To 2 Samuel chapter 15, verse 4. Do you see what he's doing? Absalom never criticized David directly. He never said the king was unjust or incompetent. He simply implied that the system was broken, that honest citizens couldn't get a fair hearing, and positioned himself as the solution. "If only I were judge," he would sigh. "Then everyone would receive justice." This is textbook political manipulation. Acknowledge people's grievances. Validate their frustrations. Present yourself as the answer without ever attacking the current leader. But Absalom went further. The text says that whenever anyone approached to bow before him, he would reach out, take their hand, and kiss them. In the ancient Near East, this was extraordinary. A prince, a royal treating commoners as equals, touching them, showing personal warmth to people who expected to prostrate themselves before power. The effect was devastating. 2 Samuel 15, verse 6. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. That phrase, "stole the hearts," appears nowhere else in Scripture quite like this. The Hebrew word for stole is the same used for theft. Absalom didn't win hearts, he took them. Transferred their loyalty from his father to himself through calculated, patient deception. And he did this for 4 years. 4 years of rising early. 4 years of standing at the gate. 4 years of handshakes and kisses and whispered sympathy. By the time Absalom was ready to act, he had built a shadow government right under David's nose. The trigger came in Hebron, the city where David himself had first been crowned king over Judah. Absalom asked permission to go there to fulfill a religious vow. David, apparently suspecting nothing, said, "Go in peace." But as soon as Absalom arrived, he sent secret messengers throughout all the tribes of Israel. The message was simple. As soon as ye hear the sound of the trumpet, then ye shall say, Absalom reigneth in Hebron. And with Absalom went 200 men out of Jerusalem, that were called. And they went in their simplicity, and they knew not anything. 2 Samuel chapter 15 verse 11. That detail matters. 200 men from Jerusalem, prominent citizens, likely accompanied Absalom to Hebron. But they went in their simplicity. They didn't know they were attending a coronation. They were cover, legitimacy, witnesses who could later say they'd been present when Absalom was declared king. And there was one more recruit, perhaps the most dangerous of all. The text tells us that Absalom sent for Ahithophel the Gilonite, David's own counselor. Now here's a detail most people miss. Ahithophel wasn't just any advisor. His counsel was legendary. 2 Samuel chapter 16 says his advice was, as if a man had inquired at the oracle of God. People treated Ahithophel's words like divine revelation. Why would such a man betray David? Some scholars note that Ahithophel was the grandfather of Bathsheba. If that genealogical connection is accurate, and it appears in 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 3 and chapter 23 verse 34, then Ahithophel may have harbored deep resentment over David's adultery with his granddaughter and murder of her husband. The sins of the past were coming home. When word reached David that the conspiracy was strong, and that the hearts of Israel had turned to Absalom, he made a decision that surprises many readers. He fled. Arise and let us flee, David told his servants, for we shall not else escape from Absalom. Make speed to depart, lest he overtake us suddenly, and bring evil upon us, and smite the city with the edge of the sword. And there came a messenger to David, saying, The hearts of the men of Israel are after Absalom. 2 Samuel chapter 15 verse 13. Think about this. David had been a warrior his entire life. He killed Goliath as a teenager. He had spent years evading Saul's assassins. He commanded an army that had never lost a major battle. And when his own son rebelled, he ran. Why? The text doesn't give us David's inner thoughts, but the broader narrative suggests an answer. Remember the prophecy Nathan delivered after David's sins with Bathsheba. The sword shall never depart from thine house. David may have seen Absalom's rebellion not merely as a political crisis, but as divine judgment, something he had earned, something he perhaps believed he had no right to resist. The flight from Jerusalem is one of the most poignant scenes in Scripture. David crossed the Kidron Valley, weeping. The whole countryside wept with him. He walked barefoot up the Mount of Olives, his head covered in mourning. Meanwhile, Absalom entered Jerusalem in triumph. And Ahithophel gave him his first piece of advice, an act so calculated in its cruelty that it echoes through history. Go in unto thy father's concubines, Ahithophel counseled, which he hath left to keep the house. And all Israel shall hear that thou art abhorred of thy father. Then shall the hands of all that are with thee be strong. In other words, publicly violate David's women. Make it impossible to reconcile. Burn the bridge so completely that your followers know there's no turning back. Absalom agreed. They pitched a tent on the roof of the palace, the same roof from which David had first spotted Bathsheba. And Absalom went in to his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. So they spread Absalom a tent upon the top of the house. And Absalom went in unto his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. 2 Samuel chapter 16, verse 22. Remember Nathan's prophecy? God had told David, I will take thy wives before thine eyes, and give them unto thy neighbor, and he shall lie with thy wives in the sight of this sun. Absalom wasn't just committing treason, he was fulfilling prophecy. The consequences of David's secret sin with Bathsheba were now being enacted publicly by his own son, on the very roof where it all began. But David hadn't fled without a plan. Before leaving Jerusalem, he had sent back his friend Hushai the Archite with a specific mission: infiltrate Absalom's court and defeat the council of Ahithophel. When Absalom asked his advisors what to do next, Ahithophel gave sound military advice. Pursue David immediately with 12,000 men. Strike while he's weary and weak. Kill only the king and bring the people back peacefully." Everyone agreed it was a good plan. Then Absalom made a fateful decision. "Call now Hushai," he said. "Let us hear what he has to say." Hushai knew everything depended on his response. He contradicted Ahithophel directly. "The counsel that Ahithophel hath given is not good at this time." He painted a picture of David as a dangerous warrior, chafed in his mind, as a bear robbed of her whelps. He warned that David wouldn't be sleeping among the regular troops. He'd be hidden somewhere, waiting to ambush the first attack. Hushai's counter-proposal was to gather a massive army from all Israel and attack with overwhelming force, with Absalom himself leading the charge. It was terrible advice, strategically speaking. Delay would give David time to regroup. A massive mobilization would be slower than a surgical strike. And putting Absalom personally on the battlefield increased the risk of losing the rebellion's leader. But it appealed to Absalom's vanity. Leading a great army into battle against his father, proving himself a warrior king. "The counsel of Hushai the Archite," Absalom declared, "is better than the counsel of Ahithophel. For the Lord had appointed to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel, to the intent that the Lord might bring evil upon Absalom." 2 Samuel chapter 17 verse 14. And now the question that haunts this entire narrative. What was Absalom's motive? Was this righteous anger gone wrong? A son who watched his sister destroyed while his father did nothing? Was it political ambition? A prince who believed he could rule better than the aging king? Was it wounded pride? A man forced to wait 5 years for acknowledgement from the father who should have defended his family? The text doesn't tell us directly, but it gives us clues. Consider the timing. Absalom began his campaign after David reconciled with him, not during the years of exile, not during the 2 years of being ignored in Jerusalem after the kiss. One interpretation: the reconciliation wasn't enough. The damage was too deep. Absalom had spent 5 years watching his father's failure to act, first against Amnon, then against himself, and concluded that David was weak, unfit to rule, too compromised by his own sins to deliver justice. Another interpretation: Absalom never wanted reconciliation at all. He wanted the throne. And once he was back in Jerusalem, in position to build a political base, he began the work he'd always intended to do. The text seems to support elements of both readings. Absalom clearly cared about justice, or at least used its language masterfully. His criticism at the gate wasn't that David was cruel, but that he was negligent. "There is no man deputed of the king to hear thee." That phrase echoes Absalom's own experience. When Tamar was violated, there was no one to hear her cry. When Absalom killed her rapist, there was no one to judge whether it was murder or justice. David's house was a place where wrongs went unaddressed. But Absalom's methods reveal something darker. Stealing hearts through manipulation, violating his father's concubines, planning not just to replace David, but to humiliate him. This was not a man seeking justice. This was a man seeking revenge. Now let's address a common misconception. Many readers assume David was a passive victim in this story, a good king betrayed by a wicked son. The text doesn't fully support that reading. David failed to punish Amnon for raping Tamar. David failed to give Absalom justice or even a hearing for years. David's own sins with Bathsheba created the conditions that Nathan prophesied would bring the sword into his house. And Ahithophel's betrayal? Potentially rooted in David's adultery with his granddaughter. The 200 men who accompanied Absalom to Hebron, in their simplicity, a reflection of how many prominent citizens were willing to follow anyone other than David. Absalom's rebellion didn't emerge from nowhere. It grew in the soil of a kingdom where the king's justice had become unreliable, where royal sins went unpunished, where grievances festered for years without resolution. Absalom exploited those conditions, but he didn't create them. There's another detail worth noting. When Ahithophel saw that his counsel was rejected in favor of Hushai's, he knew what it meant. The rebellion would fail. His betrayal of David would be exposed. And so, when Ahithophel saw that his counsel was not followed, he saddled his ass and arose and gat him home to his house, to his city, and put his household in order and hanged himself. And when Ahithophel saw that his counsel was not followed, he put his household in order and hanged himself. 2 Samuel chapter 17 verse 23. The parallel to Judas Iscariot is striking enough that scholars have noted it for centuries. Both were trusted advisors who betrayed their leaders. Both sided with the enemy to plot their master's death. Both hanged themselves when their betrayal was complete. David himself may have written about it. Psalm 41 contains this lament, "Yea, mine own familiar friend, in whom I trusted, which did eat of my bread, hath lifted up his heel against me." Ahithophel disappears from the narrative with a single verse. His advice, once valued as divine oracle, destroyed him when it was finally rejected. The battle itself came in the wood of Ephraim, a forest so dense that, according to the text, it consumed more combatants than the sword. David's last instruction to his commanders was explicit. "Deal gently for my sake with the young man, even with Absalom." All the troops heard it. The king wanted his son taken alive, but war doesn't always follow orders. Absalom was riding his mule through the forest when he passed under a great oak tree. His head, some translations say his hair, caught in the thick branches. The mule kept going. Absalom was left hanging between heaven and earth. A soldier found him and reported to Joab. The general's response was immediate. "Why did you not strike him there to the ground?" The soldier refused. He had heard the king's command. No amount of money would persuade him to raise his hand against the king's son. Joab had no such hesitation. And he took 3 darts in his hand and thrust them through the heart of Absalom, while he was yet alive in the midst of the oak. 2 Samuel chapter 18 verse 4, 3 darts through the heart. 10 of Joab's armor-bearers surrounded the hanging prince and finished the work. They cast his body into a great pit in the forest and raised a massive heap of stones over him. The prince who was praised for his beauty, the son who stole the hearts of Israel, buried in an unmarked grave under a pile of rocks. The text notes with bitter irony that during his lifetime Absalom had built a monument for himself in the king's valley because he had no son to carry on his name. He called the pillar after his own name, and it is called unto this day Absalom's place, a monument to a legacy that never was. What does the text actually state? Absalom murdered his brother Amnon after David failed to punish Amnon for raping their sister Tamar. After years of exile and estrangement, Absalom returned to Jerusalem and spent 4 years systematically building political support by positioning himself as an alternative to his father's justice. He declared himself king at Hebron, drove David from Jerusalem, and publicly violated David's concubines on the advice of Ahithophel. When Absalom's army met David's forces in the forest of Ephraim, Absalom was killed by Joab against David's explicit orders. What does the text imply? David's failures as a father and king created the conditions for Absalom's rebellion. His refusal to punish Amnon, his years of silence toward the son who avenged his daughter, his sins with Bathsheba that brought prophesied judgment on his house. The text presents Absalom's coup not as random evil, but as consequence, the harvest of seeds David himself had planted. At the same time, the text implies that Absalom crossed a line. Revenge became ambition. Grievance became cruelty. Whatever legitimate anger he may have carried, he used it to justify actions, manipulation, rape, civil war that cost thousands of lives. The text records no hesitation, no remorse, no attempt at peaceful resolution. Absalom wanted power, and he was willing to destroy his father to get it. And what can we take from this today? Perhaps this: unaddressed injustice doesn't disappear. It festers. It grows. It eventually erupts in ways far more destructive than the original wrong. David could have dealt with Amnon. He didn't. David could have reconciled with Absalom years earlier. He didn't. David could have built a kingdom where grievances had legitimate channels for resolution. He apparently didn't, and so a son who might have been a prince became instead a cautionary tale. A father who might have died surrounded by grateful heirs instead fled his own capital, weeping. The final scene is among the most devastating in Scripture. When the messenger brought news of Absalom's death, when David understood that his beautiful, charismatic, treacherous son was gone forever, the king went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said these words, "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom! Would God I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son." 2 Samuel chapter 18 verse 33. Would God I had died for thee. A father's grief, raw and absolute. No qualification about Absalom's rebellion, no relief that the threat was ended. Just the primal anguish of a parent who has lost a child, even a child who tried to kill him. David won the battle. He lost what mattered more. The throne was preserved. The dynasty continued. Solomon would eventually succeed his father and build the temple David had dreamed of. But on that night, in that chamber over the gate, David wasn't thinking about dynasties or temples or the future of Israel. He was thinking about a little boy who grew up to become a monster, and wondering, perhaps, how much of that monster he had helped create. The palace coup failed. Absalom's body rotted under a pile of stones in a forest. His grand monument stood empty for generations, a testament to ambitions that outstripped wisdom. But the questions his rebellion raised about justice delayed, about fathers and sons, about the price of unaddressed wrongs, those questions never went away. They're still echoing. Next episode, the stolen vineyard, the corruption case. Next time on Bible Case Files, a king wanted a garden. A man said no. And a queen decided that no wasn't an acceptable answer. What followed was a conspiracy involving false witnesses, forged letters, and a public execution, all for a piece of land beside the palace. Naboth's vineyard, the corruption case that brought down a dynasty. That's next time on Bible Case Files.